One thing we can safely say in these uncertain times is that the world is not short of news. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the falling of the Assad regime in Syria, Lebanon's new government, the global impact of a Trump second presidency, and of course the Israel-Palestine crisis continues as both a humanitarian and political catastrophe. But there is another humanitarian and political crisis raging that receives astoundingly little attention: the war in Sudan. I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm the director of the Conservative Middle East Council. Sudan's history has been marked by brutality, conflict and violence, and it's perhaps the complexity of the situation that has turned politicians and news editors' gaze so easily in other directions. But both the humanitarian and geopolitical implications of Sudan's war are enormous. Here to help us understand the conflict better, we're fortunate to be joined by Cameron Hudson, Senior Fellow in the Africa Programme at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, based in Washington, D.C. Cameron has served in a number of high-level roles in think tanks, NGOs, with the UN, and in the US government, specialising in Sudan and genocide, and started his government career as an intelligence analyst in the Africa Directorate at the CIA. Cameron, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
First up, the Sudan war is little covered in comparison to its importance and little known in the UK and wider afield. Can you give us a beginner's guide of what has kicked off this most recent conflict and who the main players are and what their backgrounds are?
I think that, this is a complicated subject and a complicated war, and you could go back even to the founding of Sudan in 1956 to really understand the roots of this conflict. But I think from a more contemporary perspective, what we have seen is, let me just start, in the last 20 years, you'll remember that there was a conflict in Darfur 20 years ago that captured the world's attention. The army at the time and the regime of Omar al-Bashir, fighting that conflict in Darfur, called upon Arab militia groups, which naturally existed across Darfur. They organized them into this Janjaweed militia. The Janjaweed carried out the kind of scorched earth campaign, committing genocide against the African population of Darfur. Flash forward to the end of that war, the Bashir regime was concerned that this Janjaweed militia would just start marauding around the country and creating problems for the regime. So it did two things. One, it gave those militia uniforms and they brought them into the kind of formal security structure of the country. And then under the current leader of that militia, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who goes by the nom de guerre Hemeti, he used his leadership of what became now the Rapid Support Forces, essentially to use it as a mercenary army. And the Bashir government was very happy for him to do that because it meant getting this kind of standing army of 30 or 40,000 out of the country and sending them to fight in places like Yemen and Libya and other wars around the Middle East and African region. So that went on for a number of years. It was a kind of a short-term fix that the Bashir government and the army at the time made to keep this rival group, this rival army out of the country. But what that did is it did two things, actually. One, it made the Rapid Support Forces fabulously wealthy. They were making, it is estimated, upwards of $80 million a month as a mercenary army, fighting mostly for the UAE and the Saudis in places where they were in conflict, notably in Libya and Yemen, as I said. But the other thing that it did is it made Hemeti something of a diplomat. He traveled the region as the leader of this mercenary army, establishing relationships with leaders in not just the UAE and Saudi, but in the neighboring states, using his money, so investing, using his money to invest in places like Nairobi, in Addis, creating friendships across the region and buying and building influence for himself. That's all really important to understand because what happened is in 2019, there was a popular uprising and revolution in Sudan that overthrew or removed the dictator Omar al-Bashir. That left the army and the rapid support forces in this kind of forced marriage, as it were, with no overseer to regulate the relationship between them. During that period, the international community stepped in and forced the parties to accept a kind of transitional government that used a civilian prime minister. So for a period of 2 years or so, that civilian prime minister was the kind of the speed bump, if you want to think of it that way, between these two very large, very powerful, very well endowed armies that were, eyeing each other with suspicion. At one point in late 2021, the two forces decided that the reform agenda of the civilian transitional government was essentially getting too close to their interests, to their military interests and their commercial interests and their hold on power. And so they worked jointly to overthrow the civilian government. That took us back to this period, however, where there was no kind of political force standing in between the RSF and the army. And so over the course of about a year, there was a very, very tense standoff between these two, essentially saying who's going to run the country, who's going to be in control, who's the most powerful. The international community, again, tried to mediate between them, tried to organize conversations around a kind of broad security sector reform, but neither side was really willing to take the first step to reform itself because it would mean weakening its position vis-a-vis the other. And so this went on for about 14 months until the kind of tensions between the two boiled over into the conflict that we see today. And so we are going on to, I think now, 22 months of conflict. In April, it will be the 2-year anniversary of this conflict going on between what is the kind of standing army, the constitutional army of the country, and this now kind of genocidal militia group that has presented itself as a replacement to that army, and frankly, as an engineer of its own kind of fundamental coup, attacking the roots of the 1956 republic and promising to rebuild a new Sudan. So those are the two main protagonists in this conflict.
And who are the personalities involved? So you've got the RSF, which is kind of Janjaweed 2.0, and they're led by Hemeti. Who is leading the Sudanese armed forces?
The SAF is led by a General Abdallah Burhan, and he is, a career army officer. He was part of the Army's kind of famous and perhaps, I guess, infamous battles around the country. We have to remember that just because the Army is the sort of constitutional officer of the state and probably the only state institution still left standing, it has a very notorious history. The Army was the engineer of many of the bloodiest regimes of repression that Sudan has seen. Sudan fought a long civil war with South Sudan, which is now an independent country. They estimate that more than 2 million people died during that conflict, which the army carried out. The army obviously carried out, in coordination with the Janjaweed militia, the attacks in Darfur. So, people don't forget that the army was the agent that the Bashir regime used to repress the entire country, and in most part the peripheral areas. So the sort of non-Arab areas of the capital and around the capital were, living under serious government repression for all of those years, and it was largely engineered and designed by the army. So as much as General Burhan is in some respects seen as defending the state and defending the people against this avaricious RSF militia, I think many people are conflicted because they also have a memory of the army committing really gross human rights abuses and committing crimes in the name of the Bashir regime for so many years. So that's why you hear, I think, many leaders, at least in the West, sort of say this often repeated line that there are no good guys in this conflict. And so from a Western perspective, it has been very difficult to take a side in this because it's sort of a race to the bottom in terms of the quality of leadership on either side of the battle line.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Cameron Hudson from Washington, D.C., who is Senior Fellow in the Africa Programme at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. That's very interesting. Having said that, what you've just told me through statistics is although both sides are bad, the RSF is worse, and it's not six of one, half a dozen of the other, which seems to be the assumption that we all rest on broadly in UK politics. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And I mean, if you read the kind of journalistic accounts, such as they are, or more importantly, if you follow Sudanese social media, which I do, I mean, there's a very stark pattern that we have seen over the course of this war that when the RSF takes a community, when it claims control of a city, they separate people by ethnicity. There are mass killings based upon ethnicity. There are mass rapes of women. There's mass displacement as people flee those cities trying to escape RSF rule. And when the army retakes a city, you can see people coming out into the streets celebrating, people moving back to their homes from their displaced camps. So, I mean, it is a completely opposite effect on the ground in Sudan. And I think that's what is peculiar to me is how the international community or the West can be so out of step, how we can say in our statements that we stand with the Sudanese people when, in fact, I think the majority of the Sudanese people, at least in the short term, are welcoming the liberation of their cities by the army, and they are feeling comfortable enough to return home as soon as the army takes control. That does not suggest to me that the people of Sudan, who we claim to be standing by, see these two forces in the same terms. Now, I think we can all be concerned about the kind of medium and long term of the army returning back to the kind of repressive ways that it has known in the past, and we should be preparing ourselves to prevent that from happening. But in the near term, the army is the only force in the country that is trying to bring an end to the war. They are the only force that is trying to defeat the RSF, which is a genocidal militia made up of Arab tribesmen, not just from Sudan. I think that there are estimates that 40 to 60% of the RSF are mercenary fighters brought in from Libya, from Chad, from Niger, from Nigeria. So these are Arab mercenaries brought in for no other purpose than for raping and pillaging and stealing from this country. And so I struggle to understand how we can frame these two forces in the same light.
You've just said you struggle to understand. Do you have any reason it's a puzzling thing to be presented with? Do you have any idea why the perception of the West appears to be so out of kilter with what you're saying the reality on the ground is in Sudan?
I think the best explanation I can muster is that the West has, let's call it a 30-year history with Sudan's army. We have known Sudan's army as the repressive force in the country. They have been at the negotiating table throughout the course of internationally led peace negotiations. We know full well, and I think we carry this hangover where we in the West cannot possibly view the army as a force for good, even though I think there's no other forces for good in the country other than the army. And as much as the army is a very imperfect force for good, I think what the Sudanese people have acknowledged is we depend upon them now for our very survival. And, we will deal with them post war in a different way. But for now, they are the liberators. And again, that isn't to say that the army has an unblemished, record in all of this. We have seen incidents of the army committing summary executions of people that they have accused of being RSF sympathizers or people who have aided and abetted the RSF and given them support and shelter. So they have been, very heavy-handed already in areas that they have retaken, accusing people of being, supportive of the RSF. So there are indicators that the army has, not changed its spots and that it could return to a very repressive governing structure when this war is over. So there are real concerns there. But I think if what our focus is and our interest is in trying to bring about a ceasefire so that literally tens of millions of people don't die, and so that tens of millions more can return home and regain some of the resiliency that they've lost in order to stay alive, then I think we need to think about these bedfellows in a kind of a temporal way where, to end this war, we might have to kind of hold our nose for a while and work with the army in a way to help bring about an end to this. But then we'll need to pivot very quickly to say, okay, how are you going to give up power? How are you going to make amends for the crimes that you've committed, while at the same time, doing everything we can to demobilize and dismember this militia group of the RSF that I think, as long as it does exist, will continue to prey upon the people of Sudan. So I think that requires a lot of nuance. That requires a very dynamic policy. And I don't see any Western government right now either with that degree of nuance or with that attention span that is necessary to undertake a policy like that. I think the fact of the matter is that the Trump administration is obviously, distracted by a long list of other priorities that it has. And I think that the rest of the world is basically trying to keep up with the Trump administration and what it is, what it is pursuing in lots of other parts of the world. The world order is being remade as we sit here and talk. And I think that is, that is undermining any kind of organized and thoughtful approach to how we not only end this conflict, but put Sudan onto a much more sustainable path for the future.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Cameron Hudson from Washington, D.C., who is Senior Fellow in the Africa Programme at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Can we talk a bit more about the position of the West? Tell us about the Troika, that's the agreement between the UK, the US, and Norway. What's the Troika's position on all this at the moment?
Well, I think we have to just put the Troika in its proper context as well. The Troika was stood up essentially. I mean, it's a loose configuration of those three countries that you mentioned. It came about during 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, during the negotiations to end the North-South Civil War. And Norway, the UK, and the US were the three biggest humanitarian donors to South Sudan at the time. They were deeply sympathetic to the Southern cause, not just for independence, but to live in peace. And so the three countries combined to form a kind of negotiating triumvirate to support Kenyan and local mediation to end that war. And it was a very successful, collaboration. They remained in a kind of loose collaboration over the course of the last 20 years, issuing joint statements, organizing international conversations around Sudan, whether it was around the ultimate independence of South Sudan or ending the war. They have been, I think, the three most significant international actors, both politically and from a humanitarian basis, in Sudan over the course of the last, 20 years. But I would say that the Troika has seen its influence really wane, certainly since the start of the revolution in 2019 in Sudan, and absolutely during the course of this conflict over the last 2 years. And I think that's for a number of reasons. None of those countries are giving the same level of humanitarian support that they did during the North-South Civil War. None of them are giving the same level of political support or demonstrating political interest, diplomatic interest in the way they did historically. But I think the most important element as to why they exert less influence is because they have been displaced by a whole host of what we would call middle powers from across the region, who, over the course of the last sort of 10 years or so, have quietly moved in and gained political and economic influence both in the country and across the political landscape in Sudan. So those are countries like Egypt, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. These are really the kingmakers in Sudan today, displacing the kind of traditional Western countries that for so long were the mediators and the humanitarian purveyors in the country.
Before I come to the international involvement in the conflict, can I just revert very quickly to where we are in the current state of the war in Sudan now? Things are changing fast, but gains have been made by the SAF Can they hold them? Does this point to any kind of trajectory for where the conflict might be going?
Well, certainly I would say that there has been a tidal shift in the conflict in the last 3 months or so. For the first, I suppose, 19 months of this war, you really saw the army on its back foot. I think that there's a case to be made that the RSF was preparing for this conflict well before, and that the army was not. And I think maybe the army started out as slightly overconfident that this kind of ragtag militia could really test the army. The army is, they've a kind of proper military, not certainly to meeting Western standards, but has received training, and, its leadership has been a very organized institution in the state. So I think they entered this conflict with a bit of hubris, but they were quickly dislodged from their bases in and around the capital, Khartoum, which makes this fight really very unique in Sudan's history. Most of the conflict, I mean, Sudan is a conflict prone country, but never in its history has that conflict been concentrated in the capital. It's always been, the Arab elites from the capital imposing their will on these peripheral areas of the country. And so most of the violence that the country has experienced over its history has been in these hinterland areas of South Sudan and Darfur. And so it's really quite unique to see it in the capital. And that's really why, and what explains the really high human cost of this war, with over 13 million people now displaced, many of those people from the capital, Khartoum, which was a city of 10 million people before the war. So as I said, 13 million people displaced of a country of 48 or 50 million people. We're nearing now 30 million people requiring humanitarian assistance for survival. There are outbreaks of cholera in the country right now, and what is expected to be the largest famine, frankly, in modern African history is taking root right now. So there are famine deaths daily in the country, and almost on a weekly basis, there's a new region or state in the country that is falling under an imminent famine warning. So right now, I believe it's 6 states that are under this famine warning. That's about 5 million people that are at imminent risk of famine. And I think, juxtaposing the dire humanitarian circumstances on the country, you have to remember that almost all humanitarian assistance has been, throughout the course of the war, impeded. So either because of the fighting that's been going on and humanitarians unable to access large areas of the country, or because one side or the other, the SAF or the RSF, have intentionally blocked humanitarian access, mostly because they are trying to starve out the armies in those areas. So the SAF has prevented humanitarian access from going into areas under the control of the rapid support forces, because they are trying to turn those populations against the rapid support forces and get them to blame the RSF for the lack of food, even though it's the army that has blocked it. And I think similar acts have happened on the other side. So the natural occurrence of humanitarian catastrophe is being made worse by both sides using famine and food as a weapon in their war-making toolkit right now. And of course, it's the Sudanese people who are suffering the most from that.
We've mentioned briefly the sort of retraction of the Troika and the West's role in this. With a Trump presidency coming in, what do you see as being the impact? We've seen we've seen the cutting of US aid. Do you see a Trump presidency becoming more active in that conflict in other ways?
I think there's a possibility that it could. Obviously, the global aid cutoff around the world is going to have immediate and devastating consequences in a place like Sudan, because it won't be easily replaced. And because such a high percentage of the population is already living on the edge, any disruption in the flow of aid, such as it is, will have an immediate effect. Right. And so I think that we have to be very, very concerned about that. And given the taxation on the international humanitarian system right now, because of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and various other parts of the world, the kind of global aid pipeline is already stretched very thin. So it's unlikely that UN or European actors are going to be able to step in and fill the void created by the United States, at least in the near term. So that's a real concern that we have to watch out for.
I wanted to ask in what ways a Trump administration might be able to help bring about a better state of affairs. And Also, what can the Sudanese government do to improve relations with the Trump administration? And how much does the US matter to Sudan?
A great question. I think, well, from a first part of your question on what will Trump do and what can he do, obviously, I'm not in the business of trying to predict what Trump will do and what the Trump administration will do because that's a hard task. But what I have tried to argue is I do think that there's an opportunity for the Trump administration. Whether they seize upon that opportunity is a different question. But I do think that there's an opportunity for the Trump administration to help bring about an end to this conflict. And I think there's motivation. I think there's reason why they should want to do that as well. I think a Trump administration will look at Sudan and see three priorities. Number one, not wanting to see Sudan return to being a terrorist state. I think it's worth recalling that in Trump's first administration, his first term, he actually removed Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list, a list that it was on for 30 years, more than 30 years. So that's an important milestone. Reversing that and adding them back to the list would mean, frankly, that the terrorist problem that is faced in Somalia or that is faced in the Sahel region of Africa has bled into Sudan. And that would be catastrophic because that would connect terrorist instability along the Red Sea all the way across Central Africa to the Atlantic Ocean, creating a kind of arc of instability and terrorist violence. So if that were to happen, then that would be a real setback for U.S. strategic interests and overall strategic interests in Africa. That's number one. Number two, I think that there's no value in seeing Sudan descend into a kind of failed state status. It's on the verge of that already. It's on the verge of being kind of bifurcated between these two armies. But seeing Sudan go down the path of a Libya or a Somalia with 600 miles of Red Sea coastline, with a history of terrorist violence and instability, the Trump administration wants to bring stability to the Red Sea zone, and a failed state along the Red Sea would not help them do that. So I think that there's reason to be involved to prevent that from happening. And then the last, what we've heard about in the news recently is that Sudan has been in conversations with both Russia and Iran about allowing them to establish military naval bases along the Red Sea. And again, here too, I think that what the Trump administration is interested in primarily is Middle East security and stability, then allowing either Russia or Iran a base on the Red Sea would undermine those efforts. So I think there's a lot of reasons why Trump will see a need to be involved. Again, you notice I didn't say that I think he's going to be moved by the plight of, the humanitarian crisis or the displacement crisis. I don't think that that's what's going to motivate the Trump administration in the way that it has past U.S. administrations. But nonetheless, I think there are a host of strategic reasons why he's going to need to be involved, or we'll see an opportunity to be involved. I think where he can bring a kind of a unique skill set is in the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the countries that are really, I think, influencing the course of this war right now are not the US and the UK. They are the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Turks. They are selling the weapons. They are providing the political support, the military support to one side or the other in this conflict. And the one thing that President Trump does bring to the table is excellent relations with the leaders of those countries, whether it's President Sisi, President Erdogan, MBS, MBZ, you name it. He has access and the respect of those leaders. And so he also has an agenda, an ambitious agenda for the region. And so if he wants to, for example, expand his Abraham Accords, which Sudan is one of only 4 countries that signed on to, if he wants to get Saudi Arabia to sign that agreement, then I think he's going to need to kind of mitigate the harm that is being done in Sudan. You can't well strengthen an agreement where one of 4 signatories is a failed state. In the course of the Sudan war, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are backing different sides in the conflict. So it's hard to imagine them signing an Abraham Accords agreement that brings them together when they are fighting a proxy war on opposite sides in Sudan. So I think there's a number of regional strategic reasons why, again, he is both well placed and will likely be interested to try to at least bring some kind of ceasefire to the conflict in the country.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Cameron Hudson from Washington, D.C., who is Senior Fellow in the Africa Programme at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. You actually just anticipated my next question, which was going to be the Abraham Accords. So, if that was a carrot, if you like, can we have a quick look at the sticks, in a sense, the sanctions which have been imposed? So, firstly, sanctions were imposed on the RSF leader Hemeti, some would say quite late in the conflict. And then more recently, Biden placed sanctions on Burhan. Do you think that the sanctions are placed on Hemeti quite late? Does it help anything to also place sanctions on Burhan, or does the US need to pick a side and go with it?
Well, I think that's the big question, right, as to whether or not we need to pick a side. I think that the policy of the Biden administration, and frankly of the UK and other governments, is to not pick a side and actually to say that both sides lack legitimacy to govern the country. Both sides are equally guilty of crimes, of human rights abuses, and both sides are responsible for this war. I think that policy has undermined the West's ability to play any kind of political role in Sudan because again, I think we can all remember the dark history of Sudan's army in being a repressive force in the country. There's no love lost for the army or the role that it's played in Sudan's history. That being said, the nature of the crimes that are being committed in the course of this war between these two, in my estimation, are not the same. They are not the same qualitatively or quantitatively. There are statistics out there, data by those who track it, that suggest that the RSF is responsible for upwards of 80% of civilian casualties in the course of this war. By and large, the Army, when it commits civilian casualties, it is doing so as it targets the RSF. Because let's remember, the RSF, as a militia, they don't have military bases like the Army does. So they have used the civilian population as human shields throughout the course of the war. They have displaced humans. They are living in civilian apartment blocks in the city. They are fighting in residential neighborhoods. So they have used civilians as cover throughout the course of the war. And as the Army has targeted the RSF, they have sustained or they have committed really large scale killings of civilians. But I would argue that most of that is being done in the context of fighting the RSF, whereas the RSF is committing a war against civilians, right? The reports of the RSF when they take over new territories, killing large parts of the population, displacing them, raping women, selling women and children into sexual slavery. I mean, the reports are really horrifying. Frankly, that is why the United States government, in the waning days of the Biden administration, said that the RSF was committing genocide in the country, which is, again, I think qualitatively very different from the crimes that the SAF is committing. But because we have said collectively that both sides are equally bad and equally responsible, what we have done is we've shut ourselves off from being able to have any conversation with any of them. So our ability to talk to them has been constrained because neither side wants to talk to somebody who says that they're equally responsible for the war. Oddly, we have, under the Biden administration, we were very slow to impose sanctions on the leadership of either side because we were trying to engage them. The fear was if we sanctioned these individuals, then they would not show up to peace talks that we wanted to hold or ceasefire talks that we wanted to hold. But the problem that they didn't recognize is that by saying that both sides were equally responsible, or at least that the Army was equally responsible, that they were essentially guaranteeing that the Army was never going to show up to those talks anyway. So they were undermining their own policy by taking this kind of, moral position. And I think that's what's gotten in the way. It's certainly what's getting in the way of UK policy right now, and I think it's gotten in the way of US policy for a long time. This kind of moralism about good guys and bad guys. I think we need to move beyond this really kind of simplified description. Of course, there's no good guys in this conflict, but you know what? You got to talk to people to end the war. If what you're really interested in is delivering safety and security to the tens of millions of people who are displaced and on the verge of famine or death, then that needs to be the priority and not kind of moralizing or grandstanding on a human rights agenda. I think that we can hold up human rights, but we have to be practical in how we pursue some of this because we will do a lot more to advance human rights on the ground by ending the conflict than we will by, sort of moralizing about it in New York.
I'm Charlotte Leslie. I'm speaking to Cameron Hudson, Senior Fellow in the Africa Programme at the Centre of Strategic and International Studies based in Washington, D.C. Now, Cameron, this could take a whole podcast of its own, so just give us a surface view. You've got the RSF, which has been accused of genocide by the US and Western officials and uses rape and sexual violence on a mass scale. They're supported by an Abraham Accords country, the UAE. Why have the UAE got involved?
Well, that's a great question as well. I think there's a number of reasons. One, going back to the fact that the RSF was their kind of private mercenary army for many years. They were paid and deployed by the UAE to go to Libya to fight their war in Libya, to fight their war in Yemen. So there's a relationship that exists between Hemeti and the leadership in the UAE. He is seen as loyal. He is seen as having been a very effective fighter for them. So that degree of loyalty, I think that they take seriously. I think they also take seriously the kind of narrative that Hemeti has been expounding upon, which is that he is dedicated to preventing the return of Islamist rule in Sudan. So for 30 years, more sort of radical Islamists of the Muslim Brotherhood controlled Sudan under the regime of Omar al-Bashir. And the government of the UAE fears a return anywhere in the region of Islamist rule. Sudan was the epicenter of Islamist rule, and so for its own security purposes, the UAE wants to prevent that from happening. It believes that the army is rife with Islamists, and that if the army were to win the war, we would see a return of Islamist rule in the country. That's an argument that Hemeti has made and that they have very much bought into. And so I think that for that reason as well, the UAE is supportive of the RSF. And I think that more broadly and in a longer term perspective, the RSF has been a very effective force for the UAE. The UAE it's a very small country with a very small population, and it doesn't have the kind of large standing army that a country with such a muscular foreign policy needs, right? And so the RSF is the kind of tip of the spear for UAE foreign policy. So when the UAE has wanted to project its force and its power and its influence into other countries, it has used the RSF to do so. It sees value in being able to deploy forces to back up its foreign policy. And so there's a real utility that the RSF plays in the overall Emirati foreign policy that's not easily replaceable. I think that whole combination of factors has been why the UAE has been so supportive of the RSF for so long.
Is there an aspect of the economy as well? So we know the RSF exports gold to Dubai and India, and then that's laundered into the international market. You've got gold prices at all-time highs. Is that a major factor? And is it problematic that you've got this flow of gold through the RSF to the UAE using illicit gold sales and financing militia?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't bring up the economic piece of it only because I struggle with understanding how motivated the UAE is by that piece, given their fabulous wealth already, right? If Sudan were to fall off the face of the earth, UAE would not be impoverished by it. And so the fact of the matter is, yes, much of the illegal RSF gold that flows out of the country, or frankly, all of that illegal RSF gold flowing out of the country goes through Dubai. But let's not forget that all of the official army gold flows out of the country into Dubai. So Dubai wins no matter who's in power, at least from a gold perspective. I struggle to understand, are the investments that the UAE has made in Sudan so valuable to a country that is so rich that they are willing to go to these lengths to maintain it? I mean, the UAE controls fabulous wealth around the world. I do struggle to see how owning Khartoum real estate, which is just a pile of rubble right now, is so valuable to them. Yes, perhaps having a port on the Red Sea, they signed a deal with the army before the war started that would have allowed the Dubai ports world to develop the port of Port Sudan, which would have given them, a prime Red Sea access and control over a major money producing sector of the Sudanese economy. So I do think that there's value in that for them. But ultimately, much of the wealth that is flowing out of Sudan is already flowing into Dubai, whether it's by the RSF or the army. The central bank of Sudan has relocated to the UAE. So the financial lifeline of Sudan, it all flows through Dubai. That's not going to be undone at the end of this war. So the kind of tentacles stretching from the UAE into Sudan are not going to be broken as a result of this war. And so I struggle to understand, how much the economy is the driver of their involvement, because I do think it's going to sustain itself over time. I think the real pendulum swing is around the politics and making sure that in this country, or this country is led by a compliant regime that is willing to do the UAE's bidding in the wider region. That's, I think, of more value to them.
So on that, what goes on in Sudan doesn't stay in Sudan. You've got the UAE's allies in supporting the RSF, including Chad, Central African Republic, Kenya, Haftar in Libya, the National Libyan Army, and then enablers in South Sudan and Uganda. What are their motivations in being part of this proxy allegiance? Are they all the same, or do they all have very differing agenda? And how are they going to pan out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these situations of where you sit is where you stand, right? And so if you look at a country like Egypt, they've taken in over 1 million refugees from Sudan. They share a long border. Egypt and Sudanese share a lot of the same culture and language and history. And so I think the Egyptians have a unique perspective on what happens, and they certainly want a compliant regime on their border. I think President Sisi would like to see a kind of figure like he represents in the leadership in Sudan. And General Burhan of the Sudanese Armed Forces went to military academy together. So they are brothers in arms in many ways. And I think that the Egyptians would be very happy to see a kind of military-like figure ruling the country. For Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Sudan is a prize on the Red Sea that allows them to extend their influence across the region. And so there's a real competition between those two countries about, who will have the ear of the new regime and who will be the most influential actor. Certainly the Saudis would love to have control of the eastern border and western border of the Red Sea, and the Emiratis would love to get a foothold on the Red Sea to kind of challenge Saudi supremacy there. I think the Turks see an opportunity to make a lot of money. They have already sold drones to the army in this conflict, and they are eyeing lots of contracts around reconstruction and development on infrastructure, not unlike they have done in Somalia in the past few years. So I think there's a mix of commercial interest, political interest, and geostrategic interest that all of these countries in the region and in the near region and the far region are really jockeying for position in Sudan. And again, this is a bit of a game of musical chairs, right? When the music is going to stop here real soon and everybody wants a seat, everybody wants a prime perch in Sudan when this war ends, and they're all positioning themselves to do that.
And finally, we've got a mainly UK audience here, although quite a few people from the region as well who'll be listening with interest. What role can the UK play? You're speaking from across the pond, but is there a role that we can play here in the UK, and what should we be doing to help support bringing peace to the country?
Well, I would say, what the UK can do. I mean, the UK, I'll be honest, I think has lost a lot of influence and credibility in Sudan over the years. And we've seen that just in the last few months. The UK was chairman of the UN Security Council back in November when they introduced a resolution on Sudan, which the Sudanese worked with Russia to veto. I think they did that in part to embarrass the UK and to embarrass the foreign minister, who they viewed as having snubbed the Sudanese. There's a long history there, but the UK foreign minister chose not to travel to Port Sudan as many other foreign ministers and officials have done. He wanted to view the devastation of Sudan, and so he went to neighboring Chad. But let's not forget that neighboring Chad is supporting the RSF in this war. So he went and praised a government neighboring Sudan so that he could view Sudanese refugees, but ignored the fact that that same government is aiding and abetting the RSF in this war. And so I would say go to Sudan, go to Port Sudan, meet with officials, understand better the conflict. Don't take the position that neither side should be talked to, because at the end of the day, I think people will appreciate much more efforts to end the war, even if that means that one side is victorious in the war. We are not going to end the war and see a return to civilian rule in this country anytime soon. I think that is not an achievable goal. And if we hold out to achieve that goal, to see a civilian government emerge from the ashes of this conflict, then what we will be doing is prolonging this conflict infinitely. And I think that that's not something that any of us should be in support of. But that's certainly, I think, how many Sudanese view the Western involvement right now, is that by holding out hope that some civilian arrangement is going to emerge that's going to lead us out of the war. We didn't really talk about that very much, but there really is no civilian coalition that has formed that can lead us out of this conflict right now. And so we're going to have to talk to the guys that are making this war to find a way to silence the guns, as they say, and then figure out the next steps. But I think that, recommitting ourselves to a political outcome that ends the war, that ends the suffering, and then being prepared to pivot to support a more grassroots political transition is the best route forward. It's going to require all of our countries to remain engaged and not lose sight of the fact that these crimes have been committed and this war has gone on for too long. And that's really hard to do right now.
So, a lot of work to do. Cameron Hudson speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your time and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.